A blind street violinist played a wedding song for a crying bride in a torn dress, not knowing she was running from her billionaire groom who had just discovered her deepest secret. What happened next changed both their lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon rain had just stopped, leaving the cobblestones of Washington Square Park glistening under the pale October sun. Steam rose from the wet benches as the first brave souls ventured back outside, shaking droplets from their umbrellas and breathing in that clean, post-rain air that made the city feel almost magical. Marcus Chen sat on his usual corner, his weathered violin case open at his feet, scattered with a few crumpled bills and loose change. His fingers moved across the strings with the kind of precision that comes from 20 years of practice. 20 years of learning every note by heart because his eyes had given up on him when he was just 15. The melody floating through the air was Pachelbel's Canon in D, a piece he'd played so many times he could feel each note in his bones. He didn't play for the money, though the small donations helped him afford his tiny studio apartment 6 blocks away. He played because music was the only language that made sense anymore, the only way he could touch the world around him and make it beautiful. Every morning, he'd make his way through the familiar streets with his white cane, counting the steps from his front door to this exact spot, where the acoustics bounced perfectly off the surrounding buildings and his music could reach the most souls. Marcus had been blind since a car accident stole his sight during his sophomore year at Juilliard. The doctor said he was lucky to be alive, but for months afterward, he'd felt anything but lucky. His dreams of performing at Carnegie Hall, of seeing the faces of audiences moved by his music, had crumbled along with everything else he thought his life would be. It took years of darkness, literally and figuratively, before he realized that music didn't need eyes, it needed heart. And his heart, broken as it had been, had learned to sing in ways it never could before. The late afternoon crowd was typical for a Tuesday. Office workers cutting through the park, tourists snapping photos of the fountain, college students with their backpacks and endless energy. Marcus could identify most of them just by their footsteps and the way they moved through space. The clicking heels of businesswomen, the heavy trudge of construction workers heading home, the light bounce of children running ahead of their parents. But then he heard something different. Someone was crying. Not the soft sniffling of someone with allergies or the quiet tears of someone watching a sad movie on their phone. This was raw, desperate sobbing that seemed to come from somewhere so deep, it made Marcus's chest tighten with sympathy. He kept playing, but his attention shifted toward the sound. The footsteps were uneven, stumbling, and getting closer. Through the melody of Canon in D, he heard the whisper of fabric against stone as someone sat heavily on the bench directly across from him. The crying continued, punctuated now by shaky breaths and what sounded like muttered words he couldn't quite make out. Marcus had learned to read the emotional landscape around him through sound, and this person was drowning in whatever had brought them to his corner of the park. He finished the piece and let the last note fade into the afternoon air. The crying had quieted slightly, but he could still hear the irregular breathing of someone trying to pull themselves together. Marcus tilted his head slightly, the way he always did when he was listening carefully to the world around him. "That was beautiful," came a woman's voice, hoarse from crying but still carrying a refinement that spoke of education and privilege. Could you play it again?" Marcus smiled gently, the expression that had become his default when interacting with strangers. It was warm without being intrusive, kind without being pitying. "Of course. Are you all right?" There was a long pause, and Marcus could practically feel the woman's internal struggle. "I don't think I'll ever be all right again," she finally whispered. Something in her voice made Marcus set his violin down carefully in his lap. He'd spent years learning to read the emotional temperature of his surroundings, and this woman wasn't just sad. She was terrified. "Would you like to talk about it? Sometimes strangers are the safest people to tell our troubles to." Another pause, longer this time. Marcus waited. He'd learned that silence could be more powerful than words, that sometimes people just needed space to find their voice. "I was supposed to get married today," she said finally, and Marcus could hear fresh tears in her words. "About 3 hours ago, actually. The ceremony was supposed to start at 2. Marcus nodded encouragingly, though he wasn't sure she could see it. His face was turned in her general direction, a habit he'd developed to help people feel heard even though he couldn't see them. "But you're here instead." "I'm here instead," she confirmed with a bitter laugh. "In a wedding dress that cost more than most people's cars, sitting in a park listening to street musicians instead of dancing with my new husband." "What happened?" Marcus asked gently. The story came out in fits and starts, interrupted by more tears and long pauses where she seemed to be gathering courage. Her name was Sophia Reeves, and she'd been engaged to Alexander Whitmore, heir to one of the largest pharmaceutical companies on the East Coast. It had been arranged by their families, though she'd convinced herself she could grow to love him. The wedding had been planned for over a year, every detail orchestrated by wedding planners who cost more per day than most people made in a month. But that morning, just hours before the ceremony, Alexander had confronted her with something that made her world collapse. He knew about her brother. Marcus listened without interrupting as Sophia explained about Daniel, her younger brother who'd been struggling with addiction for years. She'd been secretly paying for his treatment, sending him money, taking calls at all hours when he needed help. Their father had disowned Daniel years ago, and the family had agreed to pretend he didn't exist. But Sophia couldn't abandon him. She'd been using her trust fund, selling jewelry, doing whatever it took to keep him in treatment and off the streets. Alexander had hired private investigators before the wedding, claiming he needed to know everything about the woman he was marrying for the sake of the family business. When they discovered Daniel's existence and Sophia's financial support of his recovery, Alexander had been furious. Not because she'd been helping her brother, but because she'd hidden it from him. Because she'd lied. The confrontation had been ugly. Alexander had accused her of being deceptive, of potentially damaging his family's reputation if word got out that his wife's brother was a drug addict. He'd demanded she cut all contact with Daniel immediately and permanently if she wanted the marriage to proceed. "I stood there in my wedding dress," Sophia continued, her voice breaking, "listening to him talk about my brother like he was some kind of disease that needed to be eliminated. And I realized that I couldn't marry someone who would ask me to choose between him and my family, even the broken parts of my family." So she'd run. Right there in her wedding dress, she'd walked out of the church, leaving 300 guests, a fortune in flowers, and the future her family had planned for her. She'd had nowhere else to go, so she'd wandered until she found herself in the park, drawn by the sound of music that seemed to understand heartbreak. Marcus sat quietly for a moment after she finished, processing her story. The late afternoon sun was warming his face, and he could hear the usual sounds of the city beginning to shift toward evening. But his focus was entirely on this woman whose preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. World had just exploded. "You did the right thing," he said finally. "Did I?" Sophia's voice was small, uncertain. "I just destroyed my family's reputation," humiliated Alexander in front of everyone who matters in his world, "and threw away financial security I'll never see again. My father is probably disowning me as we speak." "You chose love over convenience," Marcus said simply. "You chose your brother over a life built on conditions and compromises you couldn't live with. That takes courage." "I don't feel very courageous," Sophia admitted. "I feel terrified and lost and completely alone." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then lifted his violin again. "Would you like me to play something else? Music has a way of making the impossible feel possible, even if just for a few minutes." "Actually," Sophia said, and Marcus could hear her shifting on the bench, "would you play a wedding song? A real one, not the stuffy classical pieces they had planned. Something that sounds like love actually feels." Marcus smiled and adjusted his position slightly. "I know just the piece." He began to play At Last by Etta James, but slower, more intimate than the original. The melody soared and dipped, carrying all the hope and longing and joy that love was supposed to bring. As he played, he could hear Sophia's breathing gradually steady, could sense some of the tension leaving her shoulders. When he finished, there was a long moment of silence. Then Sophia spoke, her voice stronger than it had been since she'd sat down. "That was perfect," she said. "That's what love should sound like." "It is what love sounds like," Marcus agreed. "Messy and complicated and worth fighting for." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two strangers who'd found each other in one of those random moments that sometimes change everything. Marcus could sense that Sophia was calmer now, though he suspected the real challenges were still ahead of her. "I should probably go," Sophia said eventually. "Figure out where I'm going to sleep tonight, since I can't exactly go home." "Do you have somewhere to go?" Marcus asked, concerned. "Friends? Other family?" Sophia was quiet for so long that Marcus worried she'd left without him noticing. Finally, she spoke. "I have some money in my personal account, enough for a hotel for a few days. After that—" She trailed off. "After that, you'll figure it out," Marcus said with quiet confidence. "People are stronger than they think, especially when they're fighting for something that matters." "How do you know?" Sophia asked. Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering how much of his own story to share. "Because I've been where you are. Different circumstances, but the same feeling of having your entire life pulled out from under you. The same terror of not knowing what comes next." He told her briefly about the accident, about losing his sight and his dreams in one moment, about the years of darkness that followed, about learning to build a completely different life from the ashes of the one he'd lost. "Music saved me," he said simply. "I don't know what will save you, but something will, and until you find it, you do whatever it takes to survive." Sophia was crying again, but these tears sounded different. Not the desperate sobs from earlier, but something gentler, more cathartic. "Thank you," she whispered, "for listening, for playing, for reminding me that maybe this isn't the end of the world." "It's not," Marcus said firmly. "It's just the end of the world as you knew it. Sometimes that's exactly what needs to happen." He heard her stand up, the rustle of her wedding dress against the bench. "I don't even know your name," she realized. "Marcus Chen," he said, extending his hand in her general direction. She took it, her grip firm, despite everything she'd been through. "Sophia Reeves. Though I suppose I don't know if that name means anything anymore." "It means exactly what you make it mean," Marcus said. "Names are just sounds until we fill them with our choices." Sophia laughed, the sound lighter than anything he'd heard from her since she'd sat down. "You should have been a philosopher instead of a musician." "Music is philosophy," Marcus replied with a grin, "just with better rhythm." As Sophia started to walk away, Marcus called after her. "I'm here every day, same time, same corner, if you ever need someone to listen." "Thank you," she called back, her voice already fading as she moved deeper into the park. Marcus sat alone as the sun began to set, the late afternoon crowd thinning out as people headed home for dinner. He played a few more pieces, but his mind kept returning to Sophia and her story. There had been something about her voice, about the way she described her situation, that made him think this encounter wasn't as random as it seemed. He'd learned to trust his instincts about people, and his instincts told him that Sophia Reeves was someone worth knowing. Someone whose story was just beginning, even though it felt like it was ending. As he packed up his violin and prepared to make his way home, Marcus found himself hoping she'd take him up on his offer to return. The park felt emptier without her presence, and he realized that for the first time in years, he was genuinely curious about what would happen to someone else. Meanwhile, across the city, Alexander Whitmore was pacing the marble floors of his family's penthouse, his wedding tuxedo long since discarded for a perfectly pressed casual shirt and slacks. The guests had been sent home hours ago, the vendors paid and dismissed, the flowers already beginning to wilt in the empty church sanctuary. His mother, Victoria Whitmore, sat rigidly in her designer chair, her face a mask of controlled fury. His father, Harrison Whitmore, stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, his silence more ominous than any shouting would have been. "She'll come back," Alexander said for the 5th time in the past hour. "This is just pre-wedding jitters taken too far. She'll realize what she's thrown away and come back." "Will she?" Victoria asked icily. "Because from where I sit, it looks like Sophia Reeves just humiliated our entire family in front of everyone who matters in this city. Do you have any idea what this will do to our reputation? To the business?" Alexander stopped pacing and turned to face his mother. "She's upset about her brother. Once she calms down and thinks rationally, she'll understand that I'm right. That we can't have that kind of liability connected to our family." Harrison finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years building a pharmaceutical empire. "You told me you had her under control, that she understood the expectations of being a Whitmore." "I thought I did," Alexander admitted, his confidence wavering for the first time. The investigators said she'd been hiding the financial support for over 2 years. She's clearly more attached to this brother than anyone realized. Find her, Harrison said simply. Bring her back. Fix this. And if she refuses? Alexander asked. Victoria's smile was cold as winter steel. Then we make sure everyone understands that she's the one who walked away from this family. We control the narrative. By tomorrow morning, every society page in the city will know that Sophia Reeves abandoned her responsibilities and broke her commitments. We'll make sure no one ever questions our decision to let her go. Alexander nodded slowly, though something in his chest felt tight at the thought of destroying Sophia's reputation. He genuinely cared for her, in his own way, but business was business, and the Whitmore name was everything. I'll have her found by morning, he said. What none of them knew was that Sophia was, at that moment, sitting in a small hotel room in Queens. Her wedding dress hung carefully in the closet, wearing a pair of jeans and a sweater she'd bought at a drugstore. She was staring at her phone, which had been buzzing constantly with calls and texts from her family, from Alexander, from friends who'd been at the wedding. She'd turned it off hours ago, but the silence felt almost as overwhelming as the noise had been. For the first time in her life, Sophia was completely alone with her choices. No family money, no social expectations, no predetermined path stretching out in front of her. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. She thought about Marcus, about the way his music had seemed to understand her heartbreak before she'd even spoken a word, about his gentle certainty that she'd figure things out, that strength could be found in the most unexpected places. Tomorrow, she'd have to start building a life from scratch. She'd have to find a job, an apartment, a way to exist in the world without the safety net she'd never realized she was dependent on. She'd have to figure out how to help Daniel without access to her trust fund, how to be a sister and a human being on her own terms. But tonight, for the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe, like the voice in her head was finally her own instead of an echo of everyone else's expectations. She fell asleep thinking about music, about the way Marcus's violin had made her feel less alone in the middle of the biggest crisis of her life, about how sometimes the most important moments happen when you're not looking for them, when you're just trying to survive long enough to see what comes next. The next morning brought crisp autumn air and the kind of golden sunlight that makes even the grittiest parts of New York look beautiful. Marcus made his usual journey to Washington Square Park, his white cane tapping out the familiar rhythm of his route. The streets were busy with the Tuesday morning rush, the sounds of traffic and construction and human ambition filling the air around him. He'd been thinking about Sophia all night, wondering if she was safe, if she'd found somewhere to stay, if she was already regretting her decision to run from her wedding. There had been something in her voice that reminded him of himself in those dark months after his accident, when everything familiar had been stripped away, and he'd had to learn how to exist all over again. Marcus set up his usual spot and began to play, letting the music flow through him the way it always did. Bach this morning, something mathematical and precise to match the orderly chaos of the city waking up. The early crowd was different from the afternoon one, more purposeful, less likely to stop and listen. But Marcus played for them anyway, adding beauty to their commute even if they didn't know they needed it. He was halfway through a particularly complex passage when he heard familiar footsteps. Lighter than yesterday, more confident, but definitely the same person. Marcus felt his face break into a genuine smile as the footsteps approached his corner. "Good morning, Marcus," came Sophia's voice, and he was relieved to hear that she sounded stronger, more settled than she had the day before. "Sophia," he said warmly, finishing the phrase he was playing before setting his violin down. "I hoped you'd come back. How are you holding up?" "Better than I expected," she said, and he heard the bench creak slightly as she sat down. "Worse than I'd like, but better than I expected." "That's progress," Marcus said. "Did you find somewhere to stay?" "A hotel in Queens," Sophia replied. "Nothing fancy, but it's clean and safe, and no one there cares who I am or who I was supposed to marry yesterday." Marcus nodded approvingly. Anonymous can be a gift sometimes. They sat quietly for a few minutes, comfortable in each other's presence in a way that should have been impossible for two people who'd just met. Marcus could sense that Sophia had something on her mind, but he'd learned the value of patience when it came to difficult conversations. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, Sophia finally said, about people being stronger than they think. And I realized I don't actually know how strong I am, she admitted. I've never had to be strong before. Everything in my life was arranged, planned, taken care of. I've never even had a job. Marcus tilted his head thoughtfully. What did you study in college? Art history, Sophia said with a self-deprecating laugh. Basically the most useless degree possible for someone who suddenly needs to support herself. I doubt that's true, Marcus said gently. What did you love about it? Sophia was quiet for a moment. The stories, she said finally. Every piece of art tells a story about the person who made it. The time they lived in, what they were trying to say to the world. I loved uncovering those stories, making connections between different artists and movements and historical moments. That doesn't sound useless at all, Marcus said. That sounds like research, analysis, communication, critical thinking. Sounds like skills to me. Maybe, Sophia said doubtfully. But it's not like there are a lot of job postings for, we'll analyze your paintings for food and rent. Marcus laughed, the sound genuine and encouraging. You might be surprised. Museums need researchers, galleries need curators. Auction houses need experts to authenticate pieces and write descriptions. Art dealers need people who can spot trends and identify valuable work. And those are just the obvious options. Sophia was quiet, and Marcus could practically hear her thinking. I never thought of it that way. I always saw my degree as this pretty, impractical thing my father let me pursue because I wasn't expected to actually use it. Well, now you get to decide what to do with it, Marcus said. What would you want to do if you could do anything? You mean if I wasn't worried about money? Or what people would think? Or whether I'm qualified enough? Exactly that. Sophia took a deep breath. There's this small gallery in Soho that showcases emerging artists. They focus on people who've never had formal representation before, who are creating beautiful work, but don't have the connections to get noticed. I used to go there sometimes when I needed to escape family events or wedding planning. The owner, Elena Vasquez, does incredible work finding and supporting artists who wouldn't get a chance anywhere else. Marcus smiled. Sounds like some place that could use someone who knows how to uncover stories and spot talent. You think I should apply there? Sophia asked, and Marcus could hear the first note of genuine excitement in her voice since he'd met her. I think you should do whatever makes you feel alive, Marcus said. But yes, I think you should apply there. They spent the rest of the morning talking about possibilities, about practical matters like apartments and budgets, about the logistics of building a life from nothing. Marcus found himself sharing more of his own story, about the years of physical therapy and orientation training, about learning to navigate the subway system and use a white cane, about the slow process of discovering that his life could be different from what he'd planned, but still meaningful. Can I ask you something? Sophia said as the morning crowd began to thin out. Of course. Why do you play here? I mean, you're clearly talented enough to play in concert halls, or teach at a conservatory, or do session work. Why sit on a street corner? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. After my accident, I spent about 2 years feeling sorry for myself. I was angry at the world, at the driver who hit me, at God, at everyone who still had their sight while I was stumbling around in the dark. I isolated myself, pushed away everyone who tried to help, convinced myself that my life was over. He paused, remembering those dark years with the kind of clarity that comes from hard-won perspective. Eventually I realized that anger was just another kind of blindness. It was keeping me from seeing all the ways I could still connect with the world, still make something beautiful out of what I had left. So I started playing again, just for myself at first. Then I started coming here. Marcus gestured around them with his bow. Every day, people walk past this corner, carrying their own pain, their own struggles, their own moments of crisis. And for just a few minutes, I can give them something beautiful. I can remind them that beauty still exists, that someone cares enough to create something lovely just for the sake of creating it. Like you did for me yesterday, Sophia said softly. Like you did for me, Marcus corrected. You reminded me why I do this. You reminded me that sometimes people need more than just music. Sometimes they need to know they're not alone. Sophia was quiet for so long that Marcus began to worry he'd said too much, shared too deeply. But when she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. I want to be like that, she said. I want to do something that matters, something that helps people feel less alone. Then you will, Marcus said with quiet certainty. The fact that you want to is already the most important part. As the noon crowd began to gather, Marcus prepared to start playing again. But Sophia had one more question. Marcus, what's your full name? I realized I don't even know your last name, and if I'm going to tell people about the man who changed my life, I should probably know what to call you. Marcus smiled. Marcus Chen. And you don't need to tell anyone about me. Just tell them about yourself. Tell them about the woman who chose love over convenience, who walked away from a life that didn't fit to find one that does. Marcus Chen, Sophia repeated, as if she was memorizing it. Thank you, Marcus Chen. As she walked away, Marcus began to play again, but his thoughts were with the brave woman who was about to discover just how strong she really was. He had a feeling their paths would cross again, and he found himself looking forward to hearing the next chapter of her story. 3 blocks away, in the gleaming offices of Whitmore Pharmaceuticals, Alexander was reviewing the private investigator's report on Sophia's whereabouts. She'd been spotted at a hotel in Queens, of all places, and had been seen that morning in Washington Square Park talking to a street musician. The investigator's photos showed Sophia in casual clothes, her hair pulled back simply, looking nothing like the polished society wife she was supposed to become. Alexander studied the images, trying to understand what could have possessed her to choose this over the life he was offering. His secretary buzzed in to announce that his father wanted to see him immediately. Alexander straightened his tie and walked down the hall to Harrison Whitmore's corner office, a space designed to intimidate with its massive desk, leather-bound books, and panoramic views of Manhattan. Have you found her? Harrison asked without preamble. Yes, sir. She's staying at a hotel in Queens and was spotted this morning in Washington Square Park. Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. Washington Square Park? What on earth is she doing there? Alexander consulted the report again, apparently talking to a blind street musician. The investigator wasn't able to get close enough to hear the conversation, but they seemed to know each other. A street musician, Harrison repeated, his voice flat with disbelief. My son's former fiancée is consorting with street musicians in public parks. It gets worse, Alexander said reluctantly. She applied for a job this afternoon at a gallery in Soho, someplace called the Vasquez Gallery that apparently specializes in unknown artists. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled in front of him. She's serious about this, then. This isn't just a tantrum. It appears not, Alexander agreed. Then we proceed with the original plan, Harrison said. By tomorrow morning, I want the story out that Sophia Reeves abandoned her commitments to our family. I want it clear that we were the injured party, that she betrayed our trust and embarrassed us publicly. Alexander nodded, though something in his chest felt hollow at the thought of destroying the woman he'd planned to marry just 24 hours earlier. Yes, sir. And Alexander, Harrison added as his son turned to leave, make sure you're seen around town with someone more appropriate. We need to control the narrative about your eligibility as well as your judgment. As Alexander left his father's office, he found himself thinking about the photos of Sophia in the park, the way her face had looked more animated talking to a stranger than it had in months of wedding planning. He pushed the thought away. Business was business, and the Whitmore reputation was everything. What Alexander didn't know was that Ilana Vasquez had already called Sophia back for a second interview, impressed by her passion and knowledge despite her lack of professional experience. What he didn't know was that Sophia had spent the afternoon apartment hunting in Brooklyn, looking at spaces she could actually afford with a gallery assistant's salary. And what he definitely didn't know was that Marcus Chen was not just any street musician. That before his accident, he'd been one of the most promising young violinists in the country, with connections throughout the classical music world that he'd never fully explored. That his quiet presence in Washington Square Park had drawn the attention of several influential people over the years, people who remembered his name from Juilliard and wondered what had happened to the brilliant young man who disappeared after his accident. But all of that would come later. For now, Sophia was discovering that freedom was both terrifying and exhilarating, that choosing your own path meant accepting responsibility for where it led, and that sometimes the most important conversations happen with strangers who have nothing to gain from your choices, except the satisfaction of seeing another person find their way. She fell asleep that night in her small hotel room, not in the mansion she'd grown up in, or the penthouse she would have moved to as Alexander's wife, but in a space she'd chosen for herself. For the first time in her life, she was exactly where she wanted to be, even if she didn't yet know where that would lead. The morning of the third day brought news that would change everything. Marcus arrived at his usual corner to find a small crowd gathered around someone reading a newspaper aloud. The voice was familiar, belonging to Jerry, an older man who'd been coming to listen to Marcus play for years, and had appointed himself unofficial town crier for the park's regular inhabitants. "Listen to this," Jerry was saying, his voice indignant. "Society bride abandons wedding, family, and commitments to consort with street musicians and pursue bohemian lifestyle. Sources close to the Whitmore family say Sophia Reeves walked away from her responsibilities without explanation, leaving hundreds of guests and a substantial financial commitment in her wake." Marcus felt his blood go cold. He didn't need to hear the rest to know they were talking about Sophia, but Jerry continued reading anyway. The article goes on to describe her as unstable and impulsive, suggests she may have been having an affair, and basically destroys her reputation completely. Jerry finished. "Sounds like somebody powerful wanted to make sure she'd regret whatever she did." Marcus stood frozen, his violin case still closed at his feet. He could hear the crowd discussing the story, some people defending Sophia's right to change her mind, others clucking about the scandal of it all. But all he could think about was how this would affect the brave woman who'd trusted a stranger with her heartbreak just 2 days earlier. He was still processing the implications when he heard familiar footsteps approaching at a near run. Sophia arrived breathless and clearly upset, but trying to maintain composure in front of the gathered crowd. "Marcus," she said quietly, and he could hear the strain in her voice. "Can we talk?" He nodded and began packing up his violin without a word. The crowd was still discussing the newspaper story, and Marcus could see how being the center of that kind of attention would be unbearable for someone already dealing with so much change. "There's a quiet coffee shop 2 blocks east," he said softly. "Can you wait for me there? I'll be right behind you." Sophia squeezed his arm gratefully and disappeared. Marcus finished packing quickly and made his way through the familiar streets, his mind racing. He'd seen this kind of character assassination before, the way powerful people could shape public opinion to protect their own interests. But experiencing it happening to someone he cared about made it feel much more personal. He found Sophia in a corner booth, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, her eyes red from crying. She looked up when he approached, and he could see the devastation in her face, even though he couldn't make out the details. "I'm so sorry," she said immediately as he sat down. "I never should have involved you in this. Now you're part of the story, and I've probably ruined your reputation along with mine." "Sophia," Marcus said gently, "you didn't ruin anything. And you didn't involve me in anything I didn't choose to be part of." "But the newspaper," she protested. "They're making it sound like I'm some kind of unstable woman who abandoned her responsibilities to run off with inappropriate men. They're suggesting I was having an affair, that I can't be trusted, that I'm mentally unfit." Marcus could hear her voice rising with panic and reached across the table to take her hand. "Take a breath," he said calmly. "This is what powerful people do when they feel like they've lost control. They try to control the story instead." "But people will believe it," Sophia said, her voice breaking. "Everyone I've ever known will read this and think I'm exactly the kind of person they're describing. And Elena, the gallery owner, she'll probably rescind the job offer. Who wants to hire someone with this kind of scandal attached to their name?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, thinking about the years he'd spent learning to navigate a world that often made assumptions about what blind people could or couldn't do, about the importance of finding people who saw past the surface to the truth underneath. "You know what I think?" he said finally. "What?" "I think the people who matter will see through this. I think Elena Vasquez, who built a gallery around supporting artists that other people overlook, is probably smart enough to recognize a smear campaign when she sees one. I think your brother, when you're able to talk to him, will understand that you gave up everything rather than give up on him. And I think you're stronger than you realize." Sophia was crying openly now, But Marcus could tell these were different tears than the desperate sobs from 2 days ago. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of someone who'd been holding their breath and could finally exhale. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked. "You're supposed to keep moving forward," Marcus said simply. "You're supposed to call Elena and explain the situation honestly. You're supposed to find an apartment and build the life you actually want instead of the one other people planned for you. You're supposed to prove, through your actions, that the person described in that newspaper story isn't who you really are." "And what if that doesn't work?" Marcus smiled, the expression that had become his default when he needed to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. "Then you'll figure out something else. That's what people do. That's what you've been doing since you walked out of that church." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the morning coffee shop crowd providing gentle background noise around them. Marcus could sense that Sophia was processing, working through the implications of this new development and what it meant for her plans. "Marcus," she said finally, "can I ask you for another favor?" "Of course." "Will you come with me when I call Elena? I know it's probably presumptuous, but I could use someone in my corner when I have that conversation." Marcus didn't hesitate. "Absolutely." What neither of them knew was that Elena Vasquez had already seen the newspaper story and had spent the morning researching everything she could find about Sophia Reeves. Elena had built her gallery on the principle that the most interesting stories often came from people who'd been overlooked or dismissed by mainstream society. A young woman who'd walked away from privilege to pursue authenticity was exactly the kind of person Elena wanted on her team. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.